Thank you for joining us for The Plain People of Pennsylvania, a lobby talk which is co-sponsored by Penn State Public Broadcasting and Penn State's Research Unplugged series. Tonight's program will be an open forum with a panel of experts who, through conversation, will help us better understand the beliefs and traditions of Old Order Mennonite, Amish and Brethren folk, the plain people we encounter here in central Pennsylvania. Who are they? What do they believe? Why do they separate themselves from outsiders? And what does the future hold for them? We'll talk about all of that and a lot more. Let's start now by introducing our guest. Donald Kraybill is a distinguished professor and senior fellow in the Young Center for Anabaptist and Pietist Studies at Elizabethtown College in Lancaster, Pennsylvania. He is the author or co-author of 7 books on plain people. His most recent is Horse and Buggy Mennonites, Hoofbeats of Humility in a Postmodern World, published by Penn State Press. Recognized as one of the nation's leading scholars on Anabaptist groups, he was called upon for his expertise by print and television news outlets from around the world in the days and weeks that followed the tragic murders of 5 Amish girls this past fall. Richard Page is an associate professor of German and linguistics at Penn State, where he teaches a course on Old Order Amish called Pennsylvania Germans, the Culture of the Sectarians. He has written articles on the Pennsylvania German language and its continued use by Old Order Amish, and is currently collecting oral histories from Amish and Mennonites in Big Valley. David Weaver-Zercher is an associate professor of American religious history at Messiah College in Grantham, Pennsylvania, and the author of The Amish in the American Imagination, a cultural history of the ways Americans have viewed, represented, and appropriated the Old Order Amish. He's also the editor of The Writing of the Amish, The Worlds of John A. Hostetler, a Penn State University press publication that examines the life and scholarly work of John Hostetler, who was born into an Old Order Amish family in 1918 and spent more than 50 years of his professional life and academic life studying the culture and society of the Amish, Mennonite, and Hutterite peoples. Stephen Scott is a research associate at the Young Center for the Study of Anabaptist and Pietist Groups at Elizabethtown College and a member of the Old Order Weaver-Brethren Church. He's the author of numerous books and articles on this subject, including Why Do They Dress That Way?, The Amish Wedding and Other Special Occasions of the Old Order Communities, and an introduction to Old Order and Conservative Mennonite groups, among others. Julia Spiker Kasdorf was born into the Amish and Mennonite community at Belleville in Mifflin County, but grew up in western Pennsylvania. She has published 2 collections of poetry, Eve's Striptease and Sleeping Preacher. She has also published a collection of essays, The Body and the Book, Writing from a Mennonite Life, and a biography, Fixing Tradition, Joseph W. Yoder, Amish American. She is an associate professor of English and Women's Studies at Penn State, where she teaches creative writing. So thank you all so much for joining us. I'll begin with you, Dr. Kraybill. When we talk about the plain people of Pennsylvania, and we know we're talking about a very diverse group, tell us who they are and where they're found in Pennsylvania.
Well, there really are 3 different tribes of plain people in Pennsylvania: the Mennonites, the Amish, and the Brethren, and they're scattered throughout the Commonwealth. And among those groups, we can really make a distinction between assimilated members and plain members, which is marked and distinguished by their dress. Among the Amish, virtually all of the Amish are plain, part of the plain community, because they dress in distinctive costume. Among the Mennonites, about half of them are assimilated. You wouldn't recognize them because of their dress, but the other half would wear distinctive plain clothing. And among the Brethren, about 95% of those would be assimilated, so you wouldn't recognize them by their clothing, and about 5% of them would be plain. And inside the plain umbrella or the plain canopy, we can also distinguish between horse and buggy driving plain people and plain people who dress plain but drive cars and drive cars and other motor vehicles, and also have electricity and telephones in their homes. So that gives us a kind of broad overview of the different groups.
Now, you study Anabaptist groups. Tell us what the term means.
The word Anabaptist comes from the 16th century time of the Protestant Reformation in Germany, and it literally means twice baptized or rebaptized. It was a derogatory nickname that the Reformers, the Catholics, and the civilian civic authorities used to refer to people that were emphasizing adult baptism. They were called twice baptized because they had been baptized as infants in the Catholic Church, and now argued that if you wanted to be a Christian and be part of a church, you should be baptized after you make a voluntary decision and then rebaptized as an adult. So they were literally baptized twice.
Now, the group we're talking about evolved or broke from the Catholic Church. How and why did they come to Pennsylvania, specifically Lancaster?
Well, these were German-speaking people, and they came into Philadelphia to Germantown through the port there. And so Pennsylvania became really their primary first area and region of settlement. They were interested in religious freedom as well as economic stability. There had been a lot of wartime experiences that they were trying to get away from in Europe, and they wanted to practice their religion without infringement from the state. So they found Pennsylvania, and particularly Penn's Commonwealth, to be very inviting for their religious practice.
And now, how important is Pennsylvania in terms of where the plain people of the United States live?
Well, if you count all of the Anabaptists across the United States, and if you look at their population, and I should make a distinction between adult members and the population. Adult members focus on those that are baptized members. The population includes the children and adult members. If you look at the total population, including children and adults, it would number about 875,000 across the United States. When you come to Pennsylvania, there are about 237,000 here, all kinds of Anabaptists, and about 100,000 are plain people. Pennsylvania really contains about 27% of the Anabaptists in the whole nation. So it really leads the way in terms of the percent that are here, followed by Ohio and then by Indiana.
Now, you identified yourself earlier as assimilated. I want to switch now to Stephen Scott, who is a member of the Old Order Weaver-Brethren. Tell us a little bit about that order.
We get our unusual name from the fact that the River Brethren originated along the Susquehanna River in Lancaster County. The group started about 1780. Like a lot of the Anabaptist groups, there was a division in the 1800s between progressives and conservatives, old orders and mainstream. So we broke from a larger group in the 1850s. The larger group is now known as the Brethren in Christ. The River Brethren, unlike the larger Brethren group that started in Germany in 1708, the River Brethren began in America in 1780, thereabouts.
Could you tell us how the Brethren view our modern world?
Well, as Don pointed out, the vast majority of those in that Brethren tribe have become assimilated. Those of my group, the Old Order River Brethren, and those from the larger Brethren group known as Old German Baptist Brethren, we probably have accepted more from the modern world than, say, the Old Order Amish.
You drive a car, for example.
I drive a car. I am a convert to the group. My wife grew up in the group. Her church adopted cars in 1954, so it was fairly late.
Can you tell us a little bit about how those sorts of decisions, we talked earlier about selective technology, how the Brethren decided that an automobile was an okay technology to adopt?
Well, it's kind of hard to believe that in 1954 that the group my wife belonged to, or that her family belonged to, decided that it was too dangerous to drive a horse and buggy. So there are still lots of people that drive horses and buggies today, and I'm sure it's no less dangerous. That was a group decision. by consensus, I suppose.
Okay. Julia, you were born into the Amish and Mennonite community at Belleville in Mifflin County, but you said grew up in western Pennsylvania. 90% of Amish children join the church as adults. So I want you to tell us a little bit about your own family, which you described earlier as a mixture of traditional, Old Order, and assimilated.
Okay. Well, and those differences can happen in the course of a lifetime as well as within a family. My father grew up in an Old Order Amish home, driving horse and buggy, plowing with horses, and he decided not to join the church of his parents. But in the 50s, his parents adopted automobiles, and cousins who belong to that church now may dress plain, but they may go to college, or other cousins may still be Old Order. So, how this happens within a family, in the case of my father, his entire family kind of drifted out of the plainer church. The children chose not to join the church. His mother died and his father remarried. And there weren't, I think the common assumption has to do with shunning and alienating people in the family. That didn't really happen in that case.
Although it was viewed as a worldly thing for your father to do, but there is certainly a relationship between you and all of your relatives to this day.
Sure. Yeah, we're still in conversation quite a lot.
David Weaver-Zercher, what sparked your interest in Plain people, and tell us a little bit about your academic interest or your scholarly work.
Yeah, well, I would have grown up in northern Indiana where there are a lot of Plain people, and so I had neighbors who were Old Order Amish. I had friends that went to school. The Amish were in public schools at that point in northern Indiana, so I had friends in my classes. When you grow up in that area, you don't necessarily think they're that different and that special, and so I think it was when I moved out of that region, particularly when I went to graduate school in North Carolina, there were people that hadn't had any contact with Amish people. And so as I got into conversations with them, I realized how, I guess, interesting the Amish really were. And I was particularly taken by the reactions of outsiders to the Amish. I remember I had a friend who told me that the best tomatoes I ever got came from Amish people. And
Still do.
And I had another friend who was very disappointed when she found out the Amish shopped at Walmart. This disappointed her greatly. So I became very interested in how the outside world thinks about the Amish, what the rest of us have invested in what the Amish are and who they are. And so that's been my scholarly interest. I often tell people I don't really study the Amish. I study the rest of us and our responses to Amish. People like you that come to a place like this to hear about the Amish.
Could you sum up how outsiders do view the Amish?
Other people further outside have a mix of views about the Amish, and there are certain things that you can latch onto, I think, to come to a pretty easy and simple conclusion that the Amish stand above the rest of us in their closeness to nature and their closeness to God. But there are enough things about Amish culture that people can latch on to other things and be very critical. So it is really a mix.
Tell us a little bit about John Hostetler. His collection is here at Penn State, and it's one of the most impressive collections of its kind.
Yes, John grew up not too far from here in Belleville, where Julia grew up. He grew up in an Amish family, although his father was disciplined by the Amish church, and the family ultimately left the Amish church, at least most of them did. John himself never joined the Amish church, but for a variety of reasons, partly through his graduate work at Penn State and being near the Amish community in Mifflin County, he began to do research on the Amish. And this was very early. This was in the 1950s. And when I say early, there hadn't been a lot of scholarly work done at that point. And John quickly established himself as the leading scholar of Amish life. And I think it wasn't debated in the late 50s and 60s and 70s who the world's leading scholar was, and it was John. And he continued to have close relationships with his Amish relatives in Mifflin County, and in many ways kind of stood between the two worlds, the larger world and the Amish world, and helped translate to one another about those other worlds.
Speaking of translating, Richard Page, your interest in, among other things, is linguistics. Most Amish, you may or may not know, are trilingual. They speak a dialect of German called Pennsylvania Dutch at home, and they use High German at worship services, and they learn English at school. Tell us a little bit about this very unusual language.
Well, Pennsylvania German is closely related to a dialect found in Germany in an area called the Palatine. And it emerged in Pennsylvania in the late 18th century, late 1700s, as a dialect of German that was really distinct from the German that's spoken in Germany. As a matter of fact, there were visitors from Germany who came to Pennsylvania in the late 18th century and sort of ridiculed the Pennsylvania Germans for speaking this form of German that they saw was just a mishmash of English and German. And that remains sort of a common misperception that Pennsylvania German has somehow been corrupted by English. But what's really happened is it's very much like German in terms of its structure, but it's borrowed a lot of English words. And probably the best way to illustrate that is a lot of things that the Amish and other Pennsylvania German speakers encountered in America that they weren't familiar to them in Germany, they use the English word for it. So the word for car is car. You know, not going to say das Auto like a German would, because that's something that they've encountered here.
We're talking about a language, though, that was never intended to be written. And how
Right.
complicated does that make your work and your interest?
Well, it makes it, the main thing that complicates it for me, in all honesty, is I speak German, so when I try to speak Pennsylvania German, I start speaking standard German. It complicates it somewhat in that it's not a standardized language. But one thing that I've become very interested in is looking at these different groups that Don kind of outlined, the assimilated versus the plain, and some groups that are sort of transitional in between, is looking at what groups continue to speak Pennsylvania German and which give it up, and what factors come into play. And that whole linguists call that language maintenance, when you maintain a minority language, and language shift when you give up one language and shift to English monolingualism.
Well, speaking, go ahead, I didn't mean to interrupt you.
No, I was just saying that, and that's the oral history project that actually Julia and I are working on together. And I see one of our collaborators out in the audience, Willard Martin. That's one thing we're trying to get at, is looking at language practices and how they've changed over the years.
Well, speaking of language maintenance, you may be surprised to know that for the last decade, Lee Thierwechter at Penns Valley High School has been offering a class on Pennsylvania Dutch, and it is standing room only for the last 10 years. And we have a short segment to share with you about that. But now that all of you know a little bit about our panelists, I hope when you come back, we come back after watching this segment, you'll have questions for them. So let's have a look.
Kannst du mich fangen? Ja, wenn sie hocken bleiben. And the English translation of that is, can you catch flies? And the answer is, yes, if they sit still.
Lee Thierwechter of Belleville, Mifflin County, teaches a 10-week course in Pennsylvania German at Penns Valley Area High School.
This class, it's conducted like those one-room country school classes were conducted years ago.
Aside from the Old Order Amish and Mennonites, fewer and fewer people speak the dialect of his youth.
When I was a child, that's all I ever heard at home and in our community, in the church, and everywhere. Everyone spoke the dialect. And after my mother died in '82, I hardly had anybody to talk the dialect with anymore.
E steht for Emma.
Thierwechter not only speaks the language, he's also a scholar and writer in the dialect. His weekly column, which appears in the Mifflin County Observer, is written in Pennsylvania German.
They didn't write the dialect, it was only spoken. And I'm sure that some of the standard Germans would have trouble understanding the dialect.
Knowing German doesn't allow you to know Pennsylvania Dutch. It's enough different that it really takes some learning, some concentration.
They either they heard grandparents speaking it, or neighbors, or they're now working with Amish people And I hear that frustration. They hear the Amish speaking it and they don't know what they're saying.
Lack of understanding is what prompted many students to sign up for the class.
My goal is to be able to at least understand, and if I understand, I think I can speak Dutch well enough so that I could carry on a reasonable conversation.
Oh, just knowledge. Yeah, gain a little bit more perspective on the culture and, the language, so that we can actually, understand what the people that we know are saying.
Because I'm rather familiar with the Pennsylvania Dutch culture, I don't want to see that go into extinction. I would like to see that maintained.
There's so many little things that have been lost over the years that really, really just need to be preserved, because it's history. It's part of who you are or who they were, or,
But the U in German is long U. Ooh.
As for Lee Thierwechter, who had nearly forgotten the dialect after years of not using it, relearning the language of his youth and teaching it to others couldn't make him happier.
It's part of your blood in my case, and I just want to, it was a childhood thing, and I just want to keep it here.
Speaking of language, Julia has written a poem titled Song of Enough. Can you tell us a little about the poem and what evoked it in the first place?
Well, it was thinking about this language that I cannot understand. I can understand a bit, I can't speak, that my father grew up speaking. And especially as I was beginning to become a writer, thinking about this language that I had no access to, that seemed to be very close to the beginnings of my family and myself. So it includes images that I've heard my father speak of from his childhood, and it's a kind of meditation on what this language is that is not written, but of course writing about it. Song of Enough. The first frosts my father, still without shoes, chased in the cows for milking, leaping from spot to tropical spot where they'd lain. On Christmas mornings, he'd find only socks on his plate and a sprinkling of hay where the reindeer had been. In summer, his mother used black market sugar to can, the greater sin to leave the peaches to rot. When damp bales of hay burst into flame, he ran from the barn to kneel by her bed, her blonde hair splayed on the pillowcase, her fevered face bright as an angel's. The parlor was never as silent as when black-clothed relatives came to sit for the loss of the barn, before all the men came back in their work clothes to hammer timbers into trusses and hoist crossbeams against the clear sky. Nor as silent as when they returned to sit with his mother's body on chairs drug in from the kitchen, while he sobbed alone behind the new barn. When he came home from college, dreaming at last in English, he reached for words that didn't exist in Pennsylvania Dutch to talk with his aunts, and for the first time wondered what you could think if all you spoke was a language with words enough for cooking and farm work and gossip.
Wow. As a linguist, I'm wondering what your reaction is to that and to the language itself as she's described it here.
Well, I mean, it's a wonderful poem. I mean, just as a non-linguist, I respond to the poem as it's a great poem. But I think one thing that's really interesting, too, is the fact that with any language, the vocabulary we have is what's in the world around us. So to give you an example, I grew up in the suburbs of Greensboro, North Carolina. I have a very limited farm vocabulary. So if I were in a German-speaking environment, I would have German words for farm implements, but not English words. So I think the Amish have plenty of Pennsylvania German words to describe their world. And if something enters their world that's from the English world, they'll just use the English word for it, which is very common to borrow words from other languages. I mean, we do it in English all the time, right? If we have some new item that we haven't seen before from another country, suddenly we'll start talking about, let me think of a good example, something like muslin is a borrowed word into English. So it happens all the time.
Okay. Yeah. I know that all of you must have some questions, and I'm going to break the ice on one that may be something you're interested in talking with. So I'm going to ask this question and then hope to see some hands raised to become part of the conversation. I think both of you, and perhaps Stephen Scott as well, were contacted by print and news media from around the world who wanted to know more about the Amish community in the days and weeks that followed the tragic shooting in early October of 5 Amish girls. Tell us a little bit, Donald Kraybill, about the world's interest in that particular tragic story.
Well, there was an enormous amount of interest based on the phone calls we received at the Young Center. We had 3 people operating 3 telephones for 8 hours straight, and I was on a 4th phone giving interviews. And then on Tuesday morning, the day after the shooting, I went out to the school site, and there were at least 50 television crews there that had come up overnight from Washington, down from New York City, international crews from all over the world with their big satellite dishes. And Nickel Mines is just a little crossroads town with about a dozen homes. And so it was just sort of surreal and unbelievable to see all this world attention being focused on this incident. So it was, and then it continued because the crews waited until the burials on Friday and Saturday. So there was really worldwide coverage of it for 5 days. I spoke to a reporter in Harrisburg that said in the 26 years that he worked with the Harrisburg Patriot, he couldn't remember of a regional event like this that had such sustained international media coverage. And it sort of was more challenging because the Amish are people that don't want to be covered by the news. So how do you cover a people that don't want to be covered? So it made it more intriguing and sensational and mysterious and sort of enchanting, I think, for the media beyond just the story of the violence itself.
They were quick to forgive Carl Roberts for what he had done, and you were quoted as saying, people should not have been so surprised. This is really at the root of the Amish forgiveness, their Christian values. Explain that for us, if you would.
Yeah, I think people were surprised. I'm not sure I said people shouldn't be, because it really is a very radical act. Christian tradition broadly talks about forgiveness, but most Christian people wouldn't think of forgiveness this quickly or think of it in the same sort of terms the Amish did. They have a deep well of resources when it comes to issues like this. They're a martyr tradition. Unlike some martyr traditions, they haven't translated that into a vengeance tradition, but rather have seen both martyrdom and suffering generally as something in God's providence, and for them to respond nonviolently, and in this case to offer forgiveness, I think draws from that long tradition that they have.
Can you expand on that for us, please, Mr. Scott?
Well, it probably goes along with biblical literalism to an extent. I mean, when the Bible says it, they don't try to explain it away, but just practice it with simple faith.
And speaking of simple, the plain dressing is also a symbol. You talked about the Amish dress for success the same as we do. Explain what your simple dress means, what it speaks to people within your community and outside of your community.
Well, that's again, a matter of biblical literalism. There are some verses that in the Bible that talk about simplicity, specifically not wearing gold or pearls. Also, it talks a lot about pride, and of course, there are a number of verses that speak about the Christian's relationship to the world. One of the more outstanding ones would be friendship with the world is enmity with God. So to identify with the world system would be considered contrary to that biblical principle.
Okay, my guess is there's a question out there. And let's not be shy.
I understand that there are no doctors in the community for obvious reasons, educational-wise. So therefore, I must ask, do the plain people, Amish, whatever, readily go to outside doctors? And if they don't, do they do a lot of in-house, in-house helping themselves?
You're doing a number of oral histories with people. Tell us about that.
We've had some interesting responses. If there's a health problem, people we've talked to will not hesitate to go to a doctor. In some ways, they're very sophisticated. We talked to one person who was referring to an Old Order person he knew who needed some surgery, and they collected money and they went down to Mexico to get the surgery, where it was much cheaper than here because they don't have health insurance. But they do they will help each other in need, this whole idea of mutual aid. But in terms of going to see the doctor, they don't hesitate really at all. Another interesting story in that regard is someone told me if I had heard about the Amish Dentist. Did you hear about this, Julia? And the Amish Dentist was actually just a farmer who would pull your teeth. If you need a tooth pulled, he would just pull it with a pair of pliers. So, this person was uneducated in the ways of modern dentistry, I guess you could say.
Can you add to that, Stephen Scott?
I guess the main problem would be the expense.
Yeah.
I visited the bishop of one of the most conservative Amish groups anywhere, and he talked about being in the hospital for numerous health problems. And even the rules on air travel are bent a bit if it's necessary to airlift patients. Even the most conservative Amish will make use of that.
I want to talk when we come back to selective technology, but I want to go to a questioner over here, please. We have someone who has a question?
From Lancaster County to Indiana County, Pennsylvania to the state of Indiana, how are the decisions made insofar as expansions? I assume some of it is population driven, but how are areas selected, and what are the problems insofar as encountering a new society as they're moving into different areas?
As I understand the question, I think you're asking how do they select new areas to establish new settlements and so on, how the decision is made. Typically, it's made actually very informal, in an informal basis. Often 6 or 8 families will be looking to set up a new settlement themselves. It doesn't particularly have the blessing of the church. It's not a centralized decision-making process. I was talking with a farmer in Lancaster just a few weeks ago, and he and 5 or 6 other families are looking at land out in Illinois. They went out to Illinois. They have a particular county that they're looking at. They're basically looking for good farmland. They're looking for land that's relatively cheap, and they're concerned about the climate. So they're hoping to buy up a good number of farms out there. They'll be able to sell a farm in Lancaster and buy 5 out there at the price that they'll get for the one in Lancaster. Sometimes there are difficulties with the surrounding township officials who aren't familiar with the Amish or with their practices. And so after they do move, sometimes it takes a while till the local officials and the Amish kind of adjust to each other. Whereas in established communities like Big Valley or Lancaster County, there's long-standing traditions there, and the local township authorities understand the Amish, and there's often a good working relationship.
And in fact, they're in Wisconsin and New York, in a Canadian province, and in 4 Latin American countries, so they certainly are growing and expanding.
They're in 27 different states and 2 Canadian provinces, Manitoba and Ontario, and the total population would be in the order of about 200,000. That's children and adults. And they're organized into about 1,570 church districts. And each church district has its own autonomy to a certain extent, which makes it very complicated to talk in generalized fashion about the Amish, because there's really 1,570 different ways of being Amish. There are some general practices that apply to all, but there are many, many variations at the local level. One church district may prohibit power lawnmowers, the other one may accept them. One may prohibit cell phones, and the next one may accept them, and on and on. So it's very, very challenging to try to generalize across North America about the Amish as somehow as though they were cut out from a single cultural cookie cutter.
All right, we have a question over here. Go ahead, please.
Well, I learned something new tonight. I didn't know that the Amish didn't go to high school, and so I just got thinking about, I was wondering what the education was like as far as history, science, and math, and what are they taught, and are they taught American history, or are they taught about China or the Middle East? Are they taught about other religions? Are there religious studies, or what is the education like?
Stephen Scott, can you start?
Science is very limited. History, to some extent, emphasis on, reading, writing, and arithmetic, of course. Surprisingly enough, there's not a great deal of teaching of religion as such. That's considered that's considered the responsibility of the church and the family. There are German classes because that's the language of the church. Yeah, somebody else can take it from here.
David?
The focus really is on very basic skills, the kind of basic reading, writing, and arithmetic that you would need to function on a farm without a lot of high technology. Now, we might look at this education and say, well, it's really not appropriate for modern society. The interesting fact is there are over 1,600 to 1,800 Amish-owned and operated very, very successful businesses in Lancaster County. And we're talking businesses that have annual sales of $5 million, $10 million a year. And the people that are operating these businesses are products of an 8th grade education like this, because their focus is on hard work, entrepreneurial skills, innovation, creativity, without all the baggage of higher education. So although the curriculum may seem impoverished to us, it really serves the Amish community very well and actually prepares entrepreneurs very well in their community.
Well, Julia, it was a higher education, I think, that sparked your father to leave the Amish community in the first place.
It's true, yeah. And it was also a very particular moment. I mean, it was the 1950s, and I think he has said, he's reflected that at that time it was much easier to make the move into the dominant culture than it would be for an Amish child now. Partly because he went to public school. He attended, it was a one-room country school, but it was before the Amish community in that area had their own schools. And also because the skills he needed, he'd gathered to go on to, he attended a Mennonite high school in Belleville.
I want to get you to read a poem, and then I'm going to take a question. So if you would read the poem, The Only Photograph of My Father as a Boy, since we were just talking about him.
The only photograph of my father as a boy. In Amish trousers and suspenders, he's barefoot by the field lane. Blonde hair, bowl cut, his face twisted. He knows this shouldn't be. This worldly uncle squinting into a box, camera commanding, hold still. That click, something flew out of him with, don't tell your mother about this. And something flew in. The next picture, high school graduation. He's grinning on the rim of the world, as confident as science in 1951.
Gives me chills. That was good. Go ahead, please.
I'm hearing that the Amish are a forgiving people. Does that mean there are no disputes? And if there are disputes, how are they settled?
Well, certainly there are disputes within Amish life. I know that in one of Don's pieces that came out shortly after the Nickel Mines event, he talked about in Amish life some of the most difficult grudges are the internal ones, and I think that that is indeed the case. As far as settling disputes, sometimes a way to deal with conflict in Amish life is to simply, finally, not talk about it. I think that the Amish, at least in many cases, tend to be conflict avoiders. And I know just from the studies that I've done of John Hostetler's family that there were deep disputes that lasted for years and years within families. So I think that the Amish would agree with the assumption of your question there that they may not be as forgiving as what everybody is giving them credit for right now. And at least in one conversation I had with an Amish woman after this event, she said that has been one of the themes in the church services since the event. Are we as good at forgiving one another and our neighbors as what the world is making us out to be? And I think the implicit assumption is, I don't think we are. We need to keep working at that.
Interesting. Stephen, Scott, can you add to that?
As far as internal disputes is concerned, oftentimes it's considered better in a church setting to divide when there are irreconcilable differences than to stay together in disunity. So that's one way of avoiding conflict that might seem inconsistent, but sometimes it's the only option rather than just going on and on with these different opinions in the same group.
When we talk about the wider culture, we talk about individualism and self-fulfillment and family and church, and I'm wondering how you would order those things among the plain people.
Well, I think the key difference between Old Order culture and mainstream culture is about individualism. We celebrate individualism, we cherish individualism, we talk about individual rights, individual preferences, going ahead, making the most that you can, getting a name for yourself, self-achievement, self-fulfillment, all of those descriptions that focus on the self and the individuation. And that's very different in Old Order culture, where the church and the community come first, then the family, then the individual. And the focus is much more on self-denial, on obedience, of yielding to the family or yielding to the community. So it's a whole different way of thinking about the individual and the community, and it's really inverted or upside down compared to the American cultural values, which would put the individual first, then the family, and then the church or the larger community.
Okay, we have a question over here, please.
I'm interested in the bishops in the Amish communities and how one becomes one, and what is their level of final word in leadership and authority.
Well, you talked about autonomy between districts and congregations, so how does one become the leader of a particular congregation? Do you want to start that?
Well, the leaders, there are really three offices of leadership. A deacon, who's responsible for the material well-being of the community, 2 or 3 ministers, preachers in the congregation, and then a bishop. And in many areas of Pennsylvania, a bishop will have responsibility over 2 districts. In many other states, each congregation has its own bishop. And all of these positions are, all of the people that hold these positions are identified through a process called casting of the lots, which is a biblical process talked about in Proverbs as well as in the Gospels. And the congregation nominates people to go into a pool of candidates. For example, if a minister is to be ordained, anyone in the congregation, including women, can name someone, and if they get 3 votes, then they go into a pool of candidates called the lot. So there may be 7 or 8 people in that pool of candidates. And then to make the final selection, songbooks are placed on a table, and there's a slip of paper in one of the books that says, quotes a Bible verse from Proverbs that talks about the lot being cast. And so they go up to the table, pull the book, whichever book they want to pull, and whoever pulls the book with that slip of paper and then would be ordained on the spot in the next few minutes. And the bishop would be ordained in the same pattern, but the bishop, to be nominated into that pool for bishop, you need to be a minister. So only ministers are eligible to become a bishop.
But the process you described a moment ago has been the source of a lot of anxiety. People who don't feel they have any particular aptitude to be a religious leader, their name may be thrown into that hat. And
well, yes and no. I would say when the congregation is thinking about who they're going to nominate, they're thinking about who they have confidence in the local congregation. Who would they want to entrust leadership to? And so the person may feel they aren't a qualified public speaker, but they also know that they have the affirmation of at least someone in the congregation. It would be the affirmation of at least 3 people in the congregation. In many ways, it's a process that really preempts conflict, because they really have a profound feeling that God is reaching down from heaven and making this choice. And if you don't like it, you don't argue with the search committee. It wasn't a vote of 70% to 30%, but you basically have to argue with God. And you have to argue with God as long as this person lives, because once they're ordained, they're in office for the rest of their life.
I'm going to take another question in just a moment, but you wrote a book called The Riddle of the Amish, and we talked earlier about inconsistencies and contradictions, and you say every culture has its riddles. We've seen Amish on rollerblades but not on bicycles. We've seen Amish drive cars but not own them. Explain why that is not as disjointed as it may appear to be, why it makes sense in a lot of ways.
Well, to us as outsiders, many of these practices of the Amish appear as inconsistencies or incongruent or even hypocritical, that they can ride in a car but not own a car. They can have a telephone, but it has to be installed outside the house. Almost all the Amish farms have tractors, but they never take them out to the field. They just use them at the barn for high power needs. I was talking with a buggy maker last week, and he was explaining all the accessories that you can have in a buggy, and he said, now we even put in a 12-volt socket so you can plug in your cell phone if you want to in the buggy. So to us on the outside, all of these things seem silly or humorous perhaps, but what I've argued in the book, The Riddle of Amish Culture, is if you study them historically and look at how they've evolved and developed, they make a lot of sense. There's really a cultural logic here. For the automobile, for example, it's a symbol of American individualism. To be American is to have an automobile. For the Amish, they're worried that that's going to pull their community apart, fragment it, separate them, take young people off to the city, and so on. So for them, the taboo on the automobile is about constraining and containing individualism. But if they hire a van and have 6 or 8 people in it, they can have a communal experience. They can go somewhere if they need to go a long distance for a funeral or a wedding or whatever, and yet have access to that technology but not give it over to the individual. So many of these things, although they may seem very foolish to us, really underneath, if you look at their historical context and how they evolved, really make a lot of sense, and there's a real cultural logic to them.
All right. I think we'll take one more question and then try to wrap this up, or 2 more questions, and then try to wrap this up with a take-home message.
I have trouble in my own mind as a Christian person trying to understand why the Amish community in general will carry on such what I think are trivial matters which leads to shunning and so on, and maybe stopping Holy Communion, prolonging it anyway, and not rapidly forgiving as you did at Nichols Mine. Can you explain that to me?
That is rather difficult to explain, but there's a difference between forgiving someone outside of the community and making amends with a person who has broken the vow to the church. And some of these trivial matters that you're referring to, again, it's some of the things like Don was talking about, these efforts to separate the church from the world. The matters of like not having a television or a radio or wearing the wrong color of clothing, those are not the issues that are focused on, rather than the attitude behind doing something differently than what the church has agreed upon. There can be forgiveness, of course, but in order to hold the community together, there has to be an order, and to let everyone do as they please, that would break down the cohesiveness of the group. I don't know how exactly to explain that, but the future of the church is considered more important than the rights of the individual, if that makes sense.
Okay, I'm going to ask Julia, thank you, to read one final poem, and then we're going to wrap things up. And this poem is called Dying with Amish Uncles. Can you tell us a little bit about what prompted this particular piece?
Both of my great-grandfathers died within the same week, and it was a very cold February. And they were both Old Order Amish men. And so as a child, being around these homes where the body was prepared in the house, and the grave was dug, I guess, by others, but after the burial, we all stood around the cemetery as the pallbearers dug the earth back into the grave. These images for a young child made a great impression. Dying with Amish uncles. The ground was frozen so hard his sons used a jackhammer to pry open a grave in the rocky field where Grustodi's wife and daughter lay under the streaked stones that tell only last names: Yoder, Zook, Yoder. Amish uncles, Grustodi's sons, shoveled earth on the box. Stones clattered on wood, then quieted while we sang hymns to the wind. Bending over the hole, Uncle Corey wouldn't wipe his dripping nose and chin. 10 years later, when we gather for July ham and moon pies, the uncles stand to sing Grustodi's favorite hymns. At God ist die Liebe, they almost laugh with the tears running into their beards. Abe and Mose and Ben do not wipe them. Their voices come deep as graves and unashamed of shirt sleeves or suspenders. Seeing them cry that brave, I think the uncles mustn't die, that they'll stay with those of us who must, being so much better than we are at weathering death.
Thank you. I'm going to go around the horn with this, but I'm going to begin with you, Don Kraybill, because you wrote that we can learn a lot about ourselves by studying the Amish. What parting thoughts would you leave with us with that in mind?
Well, I've been impressed with how there's a deep sense of identity and belonging and meaning in Old Order communities. I think these physical symbols, clothing, transportation, and so on really give a sense of identity. Young children know who they are, and there's a real deep sense of community. You know who you belong with. You know if your house or barn burns down, there's going to be hundreds of people there helping to raise it up. So that sense of being connected to a community, I think, is very valuable. And then they see meaning in many things that we don't, that there is a future providential meaning to life, and that life makes sense and it's going somewhere, and they are called to be servants in this life to God. So the themes of identity, belonging, and meaning, I think, are very important, and I think are lessons we can learn from the Old Order communities.
Okay, Richard Page?
Well, this is related to what Don says, but I like this idea of inverted values, that the Amish do value community over the individual. And I think those of us who grew up in mainstream American society have this sense of individualism so deeply imprinted on us that looking at the Amish helps me at least see a different way of perceiving life and a different way of ordering priorities. And I think that's very valuable.
How about you?
Yeah, I've thought about this a lot because my scholarship has been interested in the larger culture, the wider culture looking upon the Amish. I think I'm a little more skeptical than many people are about the transferability of lessons in Amish life to mainstream American life, simply because of what was said here about the inverted values. Some of these values, we value them, individualism and choices. We do value them. So it is hard sometimes, I think, to say, well, the Amish do it this way and they feel this. What can we borrow from that? I think that's very difficult. I would want to note, though, that what the Amish, the way that they, I think, inspire me is simply by showing it is possible. These people have made hard decisions. It is possible to resist some of the larger cultural trends that most of us participate in. They do it together, and they sacrifice a lot to do it. I'm not ready to make those sacrifices, but they do show that it's possible to live a very alternative lifestyle in American culture.
Stephen?
Well, I was attracted initially to the Amish. The Amish are sort of a city set on a hill, as the scripture says. They're there, we see their lives, and I was attracted to that lifestyle. I didn't go as far as the Amish. I mean, my life is not as separated from the world as the Old Order Amish, but they were my initial introduction to the plain people, and I'm grateful to them for being willing to be set apart as an example to follow in following the teachings of Christ very literally.
Julia?
I think a thing I think about a lot is conversation. I think people who are able to sit around and talk all Sunday afternoon. This first book of mine is full of images and stories that were just gathered in my childhood because I was sitting under the table while people were talking. And when I work with writing students, I'm surprised sometimes that the memory doesn't have a lot of voices in it. And some of that comes from being together, it comes from not having distractions. It comes from having manual labor that gathers people, and so everyone's shelling peas and talking. And so when I did the research for the biography, I would ask people, these Old Order relatives, what was Joseph Yoder like? And no one ever gave me an abstract word. And no one ever gave me an adjective. They would tell me a story. And then I would draw a judgment from the story.
All right, thank you all so very much. Julia Spiker Kasdorf, Stephen Scott, David Weaver-Zercher, Don Kraybill, and Richard Page. Thank you all so much for being with us, and to all of you, thanks so much for joining us for this lobby talk on the plain people of Pennsylvania.
A copy of the program you've just seen can